All right. Hello, everybody. It is the Vanishing Mediators. Unfortunately, we do not have our other two members due to, life circumstances. Life happens, wage labor happens. So, it is just one third of the Vanishing Mediators. But this is a very special episode in the fact that I really want to bring to the attention that even though we are a cartel in psychoanalysis, that we are also interested in emancipatory politics and Marxism. So this is what makes this episode really special. Not only that, I want to bring to your attention the importance of the name Vanishing Mediators, which comes from the late Frederick Jameson, who has recently passed away back at the end of September. So rest in power, comrade. And I think it's really important that we bring that to everyone's attention because he was a very great and influential thinker in the realm of Marxism, French theory, just emancipatory politics, dialectics, and a very great reading of Hegel and Marxist Hegelianism. So it's really honored to really have that name on our channel, The Vanishing Mediators. And without further ado, I would like to introduce our very important guest, a returning guest, Daniel Tutt. We had recently had him on to discuss psychoanalysis and the politics of the family and the crisis of initiation, which was published in the Palgraves. And he has recently published a text called on Nietzsche, Why the Left Got High Off Nietzsche, which is in line with a Marxist critique of Nietzsche, which dates back to not only Lukács, but also Lacerda. So it's a very great work, and we'll definitely have him on to talk about that next time. But he has a very important essay that was recently published and given a lecture for in Lacan in Toronto, which is called Lacan, the Logician, and the Marxist Intellectual, if I'm not mistaken.
The Logician or the Savant.
The Logician or the
Lacan's reinvention of the Marxist intellectual.
Yes,
Yeah,
exactly.
we can describe the first part.
Yes,
The
definitely.
subtitle makes it pretty self-evident what's at stake.
Yeah.
Although a lot of Lacanians might, especially left-wing Lacanians, might feel uneasy about the deeper claim that I'm making in the essay, right? Which is that um Lacan breaks from a tradition of what you might call Freudian Marxism. I don't think we can understand Lacan on that spectrum at all, precisely because um, he makes no presupposition to having like some kind of praxis whereby psychoanalysis could be like an activist discourse that could be infused into radical politics. Lacan's not like that at all. And for that matter, neither was Freud. But Freudian Marxism obviously emerges with Wilhelm Reich and it emerges after Freud. But, anyways, we do have something called Lacanian Marxism. So, my critique there is, well, what is Lacanian Marxism, really? And I felt that the release of Seminar 16 this year, 2024, which was the seminar that Lacan gave at the height of May 68, where he first rigorously examines Karl Marx, sort of opened my eyes to a number of things. I mean, one of the thinkers that first of all, we should take a step back and ask, like, why Lacan? Why French theory? Why Marxism? We should maybe make a sort of itinerary of all of these names and these thinkers and why we are. It's always good to do that. You know what I'm saying? And I would say, Andrew, I don't know about you. If I could, I'm being a bad interviewee because I'm asking questions and then answering them. But I was thinking that might be a good
Right.
way for us
It's
to
all
start.
right. Yes. And right now the popularity of French theory is very big on the internet, and you have this sort of camp of Deleuzians, Foucauldians, and Lacan sort of gets sort of lumped into that, or if you're really deep into it, then you don't really lump Lacan into there. But I think because of the Slovenian school, Ljubljana school, There's this interest in resuscitating not only Lacan but Hegel for Marx, even though there is a sort of capitalist critique. But needless to say, yeah, there are questions of like why Marxism, why Lacan, or why psychoanalysis in general, and what's the deal with French theory. Um,
Yeah, I
and I
think
think
they're valid, right?
tie in at this historical juncture of the failures of May 68, which really changed the trajectory of intelligentsia as
That's
a
the
whole.
heart of it. I think that's the heart of it, which is a serious intellectual enterprise at looking that wishes to look at the reconstitution of something like a revolutionary possibility in our time has to make a serious appraisal of the failure of the 68 uprising, which was the largest, most sustained uprising against modern capitalism. There's been a lot of new research actually about May 68 in its kind of international and global dimensions, as very much a response to imperialism, very much a response to the Vietnam War, but also interesting in the sense that it was spotlighting a form of social class agency that was seen to be a sort of implicit rebuttal of the Marxist theory of the centrality of the working class in a revolutionary sequence. And so part of the drama and the saga of 68 is the question about the mutation or even the death, as Althusser would say, of Marxism. Stalinism is hanging in the background. The censorship of Stalinism at an intellectual level is hanging in the background there. The bureaucratization of Marxism is hanging in the background of 68. The question of um, how spontaneity of uprisings can become retroactively organized becomes almost like a science. So there becomes what many scholars have referred to as like 68 presented the idea that we could assess uprisings, social movements, agitations to capitalism logically. Now, there's a logic of revolts, and there's even like a question, therefore, of a shift in the function of what the role of the intellectual is as they respond to these uprisings, these revolts. And that has interested me personally because I've lived, and I think you have too, even though I'm a bit older than you, in a time of uprisings, in a time of great instability,
Right.
in a time of uprisings in which instability, uncertainty, precarity draws people into acting out politically. Like we just had the election, and I would consider the election almost like um, a subjective acting out, right? Like a kind of obscure revolt. And I think we've had a lot of obscure revolts. And by obscure, all I mean is like unorganized, So the question of centralized organization, the question of leadership, the question of theorizing how to sustain oneself um, in the context of following something that could be revolutionary in a protest movement also presents us with like what Alain Badiou, a great philosopher, one of my mentors, calls an ethics, right? So we live in a time of the collapse of the workers' movement, and that collapse is not French theory is not the cause of that collapse, right? French theory comes as a sort of intellectual apparatus to get at that collapse, right? And so, in that sense, we should always read the various philosophers of French theory from that point of view as allies, but as critical allies, because a lot of their proposals will take the death of Marxism in directions um, that are and that have been problematic for the left. So I think our generation is still facing the kind of precipice of this legacy of thought, right? Because I think that um, a left, one of the tasks of the left in our time is actually to cultivate organic intellectuals that can articulate the true antagonisms of our world in such a way that we once again rekindle a connection to the masses, but also once again um, theorize like our own alienation, right? And theorize once again um, the basis by which our uneasiness about this society manifests itself. And that's why psychoanalysis and Lacan are so important. And
Yeah,
actually,
and
why, so final point, and that's actually why I think, because Lacan has a certain remove from revolutionary politics, but he is willing to be an advisor, if you want to call it that, or what I call a gadfly. Uh, a gadfly is like a provocative educator, right? You don't know if the gadfly is like your enemy, your antagonist. You know that he's teaching you something, but it's also mercurial. Like Lacan teaches um, through a lot of mercurial and esoteric strategies, as Milner teaches us in his work on Lacan called The Clear Work, where he says that you can actually understand the entirety of Lacan as almost dialectic between exotericism and esotericism, right? And so part of what Lacan offers to a post 68 political constellation is a series of logical formulas, right? That are like highly condensed formalisms for understanding the impasses of our discontent in modern capitalism. So Lacan is giving us a way to see our alienation, to face it, and to act accordingly.
yeah, no, I definitely agree, and I think that's a good point. First of all, to talk about how we shouldn't put the cause on the failures of May 68 or what we see today on French theory, but rather it's a sort of apparatus to kind of grapple with the fact. And of course, it had problems with sort of seeing Marxism as a defeat. The separating oneself from the Stalinism and the Sino-Soviet split going on, and then even adhering to libertinism, um, Nietzscheanism, even Heideggerianism. Foucault, I know, was definitely and Derrida very influenced by Heidegger, and so you see all of that stuff coming into the left. I think when you said something though about like the way that there's a sort of obscurantism on the subjective side of the left, and especially how we've seen today, it brings up uh, a paper that the Argentinian Marxist and psychoanalytic thinker Leon Rosicner says a left without a subject. It's that the left does not have a subject and can't operate, or even you could possibly even say in the Baudouin sense, think of a politics, as a have a thought of politics. And I don't know if you stand by this still, but I remember in our last discussion on your work on the politics of the family that you have said that there is a sort of superego that the left has that creates a schism from any sort of solidarity. And and maybe there is in the classical Freudian sense a history to that keeps on passing down onto each generation of the left of the superegoic thing that censors any sort of thinking from happening. And it's interesting that I said censor because we see because your paper has to deal with, as you said, the relationship of Lacan's thinking of Marxism in Seminar 16 and even Seminar 17. But he talks about thought as censorship, and this slogan of freedom of thought is actually something that is self-defeating because of what these intellectuals, and specifically he's talking about the Marxists, have only focused on a self-consciousness in and for itself, but can't think of what keeps that from happening. And it is the fact that something of the unconscious manifests in these revolutionary logics that keeps it from happening. What they want is actually censored from what they say. So something on the level of enunciation is happening, but on the enunciated part is getting sort of confused, and he kind of mentions this with Hegel's notion of truth and knowledge, and how they emerge with one in this process of the totalizing I. right? And so the totalizing I of the revolutionary subject is censored out or can't complete itself for what it wants. And this has to do with knowledge and jouissance and the production of the discourse in the university. But my main point is the fact that what we see happening is what is being sloganed is a form of censorship.
Yeah, it's good. I
No,
mean,
yeah, I don't know if you would agree with that,
mhm,
or what your thoughts are.
sure. In a certain way, I think that an unorganized left that has lost its sort of foothold in the party system, lost its foothold even within the electoral arena, faces a conundrum of libertarianism, and that will be something that becomes almost like a kind of repetition. And so what ends up happening is that the left becomes defined, and I think this is still true in our time, off of how it galvanizes what I refer to in my work as egalitarian ruptures, right? So like for what's an example of that? Like if you think about the left more generally in today's time, and you think about where the left has made its most seismic contribution to, and here by the left, I mean like the radical left, that's committed to a strident anti-capitalist position, right? I don't mean progressive liberals. I don't mean democratic socialists, right? So anyways, so I would argue it's like take the George Floyd uprising, right? And one of the things that occurred in the Floyd uprising, right, was an interesting um, kind of reverberation or sort of collapse in communication with the existing liberal intelligentsia and all of its institutions, such that that event kind of hystericized the liberal center. And for a moment, right, for a moment, we saw emerge the possibility of articulating something that would truly get at the systemic constitution of the subjectivity of George Floyd himself as a kind of paradigm. So Floyd became a kind of paradigm that we could articulate, right? A politics of anti-capitalist, um, sort of righteous anger and sort of concentrated on this moment. And I noticed that um, what ended up happening was all of that um, dynamic, libidinal, unorganized, spontaneous articulation of these demands. What they ended up sort of trying to do was sort of, at best, right, sort of create almost like a sustained protest that would um, like shock the system some ways, shock the system, and it would shock it by time and duration of protest activity. And the same was true of Occupy. The same was true of the movement of the squares. The same was true with what we call the alter globalization movement in the early 90s. And all of that had a type of touchstone point in the rebirth of radical social democracy, Jeremy Corbyn, Bernie Sanders. And a very interesting thing has happened, I think, which is that all of that, all of the possible logical um, content of those spontaneous uprisings have seemingly been pacified time and again by the inertia of a kind of market slash state apparatus. So one of the big um, stumbling blocks of our time is how we can penetrate into this edifice of a market state nexus, for which we can call that various names and so on, um, how we can penetrate into this and actually gain a foothold so that um, we can start to reconstitute the meaning of the left. Now, one of my claims has been, Andrew, that in the face of these defeats, right, the fact that Trump just got reelected and the left had nothing to do, which in some sense was actually strategically good, that we are not responsible for his election because most of us abstained, right? Out of a protest because of what's happening in Gaza. But you know what I'm trying to say is that I feel that we have to focus on a conceptual redefinition of the left in this moment. Now is the time actually for intellectual engagement. That's part of the reason why I do the Emancipation Study Group Collective. That's part of
No,
the
yeah,
reason why we should read Lacan.
right.
It's an advice also that Lenin would have as well, right? In times of great reaction and obscure, spontaneous uprisings that don't go anywhere, we should think, together, right? As comrades and so on. That's what motivates me to read Lacan. And Lacan, as you know in Seminar 16, is very copacetic to Marxists. And he's sort of like a perfect interlocutor in some sense. He is psychoanalyzing Marxism. I think that's fair to say. And we can now talk about what he diagnoses, yeah, what he says, right?
Yeah.
About class consciousness, because he takes on a phenomenology or a kind of latent phenomenology of class consciousness in Seminar 16. And I never knew that he had done that until reading it. And it was quite striking. Like, for example, there's a lot of silent partners in Lacan's seminars. One of the silent partners is Camus. Did you know that? In
Yeah, I
Seminar
mean,
16.
especially because he does talk about the rebel, right?
Hmm.
And he's referring to Camus' rebel, which is got to be, you know, they defeat because they can't understand the way that both knowledge production and the absolutization of the market, which he will talk about in Seminar 16, creates a way in which the Marxists and even revolutionaries in general cannot see how knowledge of any
Hmm.
sort of revolution that can be produced for the proletariat becomes subverted. And therefore, they become what he'll call a dupe, which I know you touch
Hmm.
upon and say
Hmm.
as
Hmm.
well. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So I think we should take a step back and analyze Lacan's theory of the metamorphosis within the labor process of value. And he argues that there's sort of like a split in value that takes place, and that there is a kind of preordained. This is why capitalism is what he calls a master's discourse, because there's like a preordained knowledge that the worker and the capitalist, and then by capitalist, and Marx includes like the manager, the overseer, the supervisor, and so on. They're kind of included. So the capitalist is actually off the factory floor, of course, right? But there's a certain omniscience of that which will be have done, production for production's sake. And this is like the unconscious. This is like the A that becomes part of the labor process and part of exploitation. And Lacan praises Marx because Marx shows that this actually is perceived by the capitalist as a joke.
Yes.
Um,
Yeah.
right?
And can you go
And
into depth with that? Because this has to go with the logic of both the production of capital and of the homology that Lacan will make between plus de jouir, which is surplus jouissance or surplus enjoyment, and that is surplus value in Marx.
yeah, exactly. It's so in the Marxist understanding of a dialectic of the in itself and the for itself would be one in which the worker gains class consciousness. However, for Lacan, that process risks missing out entirely on Freud. And Freud's insights, of course, touch upon the production of unconscious desire. And moreover, there is a neologism that Lacan gives, and he inserts it into the theory of surplus value and capital, so volume 1, chapter 7 in particular, where it's called Merlust, right? which is like lust, a neologism Lacan creates that is like lust and enjoyment in one. And he shows that at stake in the production of surplus value is jouissance, and that jouissance in a certain way um, is exactly what is not and cannot be thought within the so-called dialectic of Marxism. In other words, he accuses like what you could call Lukácsian Marxism or the Marxism of Lucien Goldmann, or what he calls a kind of religious Marxism, Stalinist Marxism, let's say, or even Leninism, yeah, as sort of possessing like a theory of the subject, which is almost like a reflective theory, right? In which they actually possess no way of understanding alterity or otherness in the process of self-consciousness. And therefore, they end up having nothing to say regarding the truth, because for Lacan, capitalism produces surplus, a surplus object, but it also produces a split within that surplus object, like a detritus, a trash. And this is actually uh, the precise receptacle point at which the worker himself or herself is also located. So the production of the small a, the production of the object cause of desire, is sort of paradoxically alienating within this wider process of exploitation. And without Freud, without understanding um, how enjoyment is actually perversely and sadistically, in some sense, or it doesn't have to be that way, but it can be and often is in capitalism, um, shutting down exploitation, or rather the truth of exploitation, right, is one of the key insights that Lacan makes. And that is, I think, very much a pessimistic insight. In other words, um, Lacan will say that he's the first in the history of Marxology to pinpoint the moment at which the capitalist laughs at the knowledge that um, they can, at the end of the labor process, associate their labor as equivalent to the labor of the worker. And then they proceed to laugh. So that to me sounds like very much a sadism in some way, but that's a sadism that is extremely common. Like, why is it in capitalism that this kind of um, sadistic exploitation exists across all sectors of the economy? Because that's another point that Lacan will sort of intimate, which is that exploitation is automatic in capitalism. And in fact, he takes his thinking of Marx so far because he thinks that Marx um, already had a premonition to this notion of the object A. And we'll talk about that in a moment, because the only way to really understand the historical origin of the object A in capitalism is by going back to Pascal in the 17th century, which we'll get to in a moment.
Yeah.
But anyways, one of the things that Lacan teaches Marx is that the unconscious also has the production of a surplus object that is part of its automatic production for production. It follows the law of production for production's sake. And of course, as we know, the unconscious is also um, relates to a structure of non-contradiction. And so what I'm trying to say is that Seminar 16 shows a lot. It shows a lot in the meta-psychology of Lacan, the degree to which Lacan is re-theorizing the very structure of the unconscious inspired by Marxist theories. But what I tried to show in my paper, which is a little different than that, you notice in the beginning, I just sort of touch upon this. What I really try to show is more about how truth and knowledge is understood by Marxist intellectuals at the time in a way that Lacan thinks is very limited, and relegating the Marxist to someone who cannot see the logic of revolts. So we have a new series of revolts and agitations and antagonisms in capitalism. And the very thinkers who should be the ones to assist the proletariat in their uprising don't know the first thing about these uprisings, right? And there's many reasons for that. But look, one of the main ones is this idea that you have to understand Freud to understand exploitation of capitalism and how enjoyment creates these elisions, disavowals, sadisms, perversities at the heart of the exchange relation itself. And like, so what he says basically is that Marxism wants to make the class conscious worker a savant, but that doesn't get them anywhere because is a subjectivity that possesses knowledge for how to get things done. So you could think of a savant kind of broadly. I mean, generally you have a savant who's kind of like a Renaissance man. You think of a savant as a worldly thinker, but also you think of a savant as something more than just like an academician or a scholar. No, they're kind of like more than that in some sense. They're not
Right. And
they're like another example of a savant might be like an Oscar Wilde type figure, like a dandy, you know, a thinker who also possesses an aesthetic. Hmm?
right. Yeah.
A final point. A savant is revolutionary or is important for anybody that wants to revolutionize society because they possess a they know how to live, right? That's the very important form of knowledge, which most scholars actually don't. Scholars possess what Aquinas called theoria, right? Theoretical knowledge. Theoretical knowledge is not savoir-faire, right? It's actually two different things. And so Lacan is interested in Marxists, right? Because savoir-faire, right? Knowledge of how to lead a good life. That's exactly what psychoanalysis is wanting to do. You see the point? So in that sense, that's why Lacan is talking about Marxism so much, because Marxism is trying to produce a similar subject effect. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but it's limited and well when you were talking about the savant versus the savoir-faire, which is like the savoir-faire is kind of like the
They're
know-how
the same.
to.
They're the same.
They're the same.
They're
Okay.
the same. Yes, savoir-faire is the type of knowledge that the savant would possess.
Would possess, but the
They
workers
would
don't have
possess it. Yeah,
that.
they
Yeah.
would have the knowledge of how to have a good time.
Yeah.
Savoir-faire is like knowledge of how to have a good time, how to get around.
Yes, yeah,
Like
exactly. Which apparently like
like
someone
it's
like Lenin even had too, apparently. Like
well, I mean, it's
historically, like
well, no, I mean that's actually an interesting question, right? Because in a certain sense, in a modern bureaucratic Western, hyper-modern society after the war, after World War II, the Marxist intellectual in the cities of Paris and London and New York, right? Um, they're going to be less like a guerrilla militant going up into the mountains with armed struggle and AKs, obviously. But no, they're going to be more like a figure who can live in multiple worlds and know the multiplicity of subject positions and be able to impart knowledge accordingly. Right. And so, in that sense, one of the things I was interested in the paper is sort of like, yeah, what is the construction of an intellectual who would be capable, right, of adequately imparting a knowledge for the proletariat in how to, like the heart of the Zizek Peterson debate was an interesting one. It wasn't like what's the meaning of revolution, it was what is happiness. Yeah. It's very Aristotelian, you know. In some sense, yeah, that's like that that means even I would say, and this is one of the things that French theory is quite interesting about, French theory we turn to because it was the last time in which exemplars or models of intellectuals emerged, right? What do I mean by that? Lacan is a figure who's trying to construct a total system of thought, in a sense, right? In the sense of like, it is important to stake claim to the Lacanian theory of how certain things work and don't work, right? In the same way that it's true for the Sartrean approach. So my question is, what does that look like for Marxism? And especially, what does that look like for Marxism, which itself is a tradition that has always been, and this is only owed to my reading in the history of like Marx and Engels as political figures, right? As political figures, Marx and Engels were doing that with other intellectuals in their milieu. You know what I mean? They were criticizing the direction that intellectual life should take. In other words, there are codified uh, parameters for how to think an organic intellectual who could make an impact in the class struggle, right? So if you're drawn to the life of the mind and you're drawn to revolutionary thought, like there's in a certain sense there's like directions that you can follow and not follow. And I think that Lacan, because his thought is so rich, has actually gone to inventing like a certain direction of Marxist intellectuals. That in a sense, I was juxtaposing it between the logician and the savant. By that I mean all I mean by that, right, is that um, in some sense it's not an either or. It's more along the lines of um, there's something deficient, and Lacan may still be true. There's something deficient that Marxism requires a supplement to its own discourse in order to actualize it. And I've actually thought I've had that premonition for a while. And I've always felt, Andrew, that it is psychoanalysis that Marxism needs. And, you know, the more orthodox Marxist schools that I interact with, you know, the more orthodox they are, the more they tend to be hostile to that claim.
Yes.
So I've actually been trying to balance these questions because where I've landed, where I was, was in the position that psychoanalysis actually has epistemic superiority to Marxism. That's where I was. And that's where I would say, Andrew, most Lacanians are at. Because most Lacanians haven't fully grasped all of Lacan. I have not, for example. And because of that, um, he's still leading you to something, right? It's like a horse taking you to water, right? and And so I think as a result, Marxism, especially because Marxism as a historical force has been waning, I think that a lot of Lacanian Marxists have kind of abrogated a lot of things to Lacan. And I have tried to reverse that for in a certain way, but not in some vulgar way of saying, oh, well, Lacan should be rejected. None at all. Like, again, I want to position him as this kind of like logical gadfly that can help resolve some paradoxes and puzzles of Marxism. You know what I'm saying? So, anyways, that's like a little bit of a side point.
Yeah, and I mean, like, it seems like, and this is something that you've addressed too in the essay, from a text on Jacques Rancière on Althusser's Lessons, that Marx has been sort of reduced down to a sort of scholasticism. And I think what we see now is that most Lacanians, to generalize, only use Marx insofar as it's a scholastic reading, and obviously this has more historical like points than just Lacanians. But if you've noticed, there's always this sort of antagonism of lumping together Marx and Engels, and I think when you jettison Engels out of the picture and then you reduce Marx down to a scholasticism of looking at just the logic of capital from an academician point, you miss the political endeavors that were surrounding not only Marx but also with the assistance of Engels, who was also looking at political economy and political uprisings before meeting Marx. And I think that sort of this Lacanian leftism that we see that leaves Engels out also kind of misses the grand picture of the Marxist project that was started from Marx and Engels. And I think it's something that I think when it comes to psychoanalytic Marxism, it's not a sort of happy marriage, but psychoanalysis does, I think, as you put it clearly, help with those paradoxes. Like Lacan is that gadfly that kind of helps you work through these contradictions that we see internal to Marxist discourse and revolutionary discourse. And it also goes to the fact that there is a sort of subject to Marx, but the subjectivity I think in psychoanalysis is a bit more nuanced. And I think someone like Leon Rosichner, outside of Lacan, has pointed that out in his text on Freud and the Limits of Bourgeois Individualism. Um, and one of the things I did want to point out and kind of tell to the audience, because you mentioned this in the beginning, that one of the historical things of not that you're pointing out in your essay, but also in Seminar 16, that Milner talks about is this dialogue that Lacan is having between Stalin. And and I want to point out this distinction that you made. We have Stalin, the
Hmm.
leader of the USSR, the dictator, and then we have
Hmm.
Stalin, the intellectual. And this contrast between, I think, maybe you could correct me if I'm wrong, the savant. What we have is a master, and Stalin is that master intellectual who wants to be a Renaissance man of everything. And what Lacan is internally debating with when he comes up with this discourse theory is a seminal essay that Stalin wrote in the 1950s on Marxism and the problem of language or linguistics, to which he
Yeah.
says that he analyzes base and superstructure, and he says, well, you have base, which is going to be the economic part. Russia has a base. The Western economy has a base that would be capitalism. And our base today is the USSR that we have, and then you have the superstructure would be the political aspect, the churches, the state, all these things. They may change, but language doesn't. And he conflates linguistics with language, and he says like the Russian language stays the same. Sure, we may have a bunch of slang terms that move and operate and change over time, but the language stays the same. And I think that's a very vulgar and crude way to understand language, because this is not the way that Lacan or even any other linguistics would, talk about linguistics. It would not be to look at a specific language like Russian, French, but the sort of rules and structures that happen. And of course, Lacan was versed in Saussurian linguistics, so he's looking at the function of the sign or the signifier, but also how it relates to the unconscious, and being able to apply that to the logic of the discourse that keeps revolutionary praxis from happening. So that's the one thing to point out for anybody who doesn't know. That is a very interesting historical moment of Lacan debating with Stalin on the nature of language or linguistics. But I guess
Hmm.
maybe if you don't have anything to add to that, because you brought up again or you clarified what you meant by the laughter of the capitalist. How the sadism is that they're able to take themselves into account as being exploited, because I think what this shows is that there is a sort of autonomy to the market that even the capitalists who are outside of the labor process yet take the surplus value from, can't account for themselves as exploited workers to make sure, that this system runs autonomously like a god. And they get some sort of pleasure out of it, or if you could say. And I guess what I want to kind of lead into is, again, sadism a perversion, because this ties directly to one, the inconsistency of the other, and Pascal. because
Mm.
Pascal has a lot to do, according to Lacan, with the logic of perversion as a
Hmm.
wager and the inconsistency of the other, which can be stopped with this wager, um, and sort of made whole again. And he relates the inconsistency of God in Pascal with the inconsistency of the other, and the way that this happens with the absolutization of the market.
Yeah, that's it's very interesting because I mean Pascal is an interesting figure. I mean, he's associated with a conservative Catholic movement called Jansenism, which was basically connected to this aristocratic class called the noblesse du robe. And so they were kind of scholars that had excess free time. And one of the things Pascal witnessed in his time was a crisis of the intellectuals, right? So just think for a second of the crisis of Marxism that Lacan's facing. This is part of the reason why there's a kind of grand historical analogy going on, you see, right? And Lacan's almost positioning himself as a Pascal to the Marxist savant, to the Marxist logician, arguing for a logic, which is actually sort of what exactly Pascal was doing. And Pascal is trying to give a solution for the alienation of the individual at a moment when two things are happening broadly. One, what you just said, the absolutization of the market, which is basically the moment at which this process of the generation of surplus value becomes visible in the social field for the first time. And Lacan will basically argue when that is what the absolutization of the market is. It's the capacity for um, enjoyment to be kind of coordinated as an apparatus and extracted. Um, Almost like you could think about this vis-a-vis the Marxist theory of appropriation and also of primitive accumulation as well, right? So you have these kind of nodes of surplus extraction, which have effects in upsetting the belief system. So the claim that Lacan makes is that Pascal emerges to resolve a crisis of belief. Now, that's also a claim from a second thing that was happening, which is the rise of rationalism in science. And the rise of rationalism in science put forward this idea of an alienated subject facing a cosmos which is fundamentally empty and devoid of higher meaning and purpose. And that the old Augustinian cosmos, right, and its sort of transcendental guarantees and so on, are no longer assured at the level of knowledge and truth. So there's a crisis in knowledge and truth brought on by rationalism. And so Pascal's wager is a way to invent a new this is now here I'm kind of reading Goldmann's book called The Hidden God, is a way to invent a new solution to what would be bourgeois individualism by creating the deification of the I. You could call it the deification of the I by inserting the I into a continual process of affirmation regarding a point of absolute certainty and knowability. But that absolute certainty and knowability is ultimately paradoxical precisely because for Pascal, belief is almost like Pavlovian. You sort of like you wager on God's existence even despite the knowledge. So like the quality of that knowledge is of like a radical a priori status in the Kantian sense, right? And in that regard, you're making a wager on something which you cannot prove. Um, so it's quite complex and it's quite interesting. Now, let's give Goldmann's reading of Pascal its due, and let's see what he has to say. So what he says is that Pascal initiates a sort of solution for the invention of bourgeois individualism before the bourgeoisie existed that is important because what at the heart of Pascal's philosophy is about is ultimately a wager on the kind of unchangeable I. It's a wager on the affirmation of um, the fixed, tragic, isolated condition of man. That also goes back to Jansenism. Jansenism is a highly pessimist, tragic philosophy. Predestination, but we are damned. And we must accept that condition.
And it kind of comes from this sort of, historical debate between the Augustinian sort of fallen from grace of original sin
Mm-hmm.
versus Pelagius's argument of,
Pelagius, yeah.
yeah,
So
of,
Pelagius, yeah, exactly. And so what Goldman will say is that Pelagius, you know how we talked before about the Floyd uprising as an egalitarian
yeah,
expression? Pelagius argues that the condition of man is not fated to this tragic pessimist um, condition of pure damnation, but that rather man can overcome original sin. Okay. And so uh, Goldman does an incredible thing, I think, where he creates this intellectual genealogy, incorporating the notion of the wager, but collectivizing it as what would become a necessary tool for the liberation of the proletariat once we get to industrial capitalism. And that Marxism must be Pascalian. So we're coming full circle now. It's like, oh, okay, well, if Lacan can pinpoint this thing called the object A and help us with a certain form of alienation born from monstrous enjoyment and its production in capitalism, Pascal gives Marxism the wager, and the wager for Marxism is the construction of a Weltanschauung of the working class and the proletariat that would be capable of affirming that history has a meaning and purpose. So it's kind of like you could think of it kind of like the Marxist wager is a reversal of the bourgeois individualism of Pascal,
right. Now,
right?
I want you
It's
to
very
keep going.
parasitical. I mean, it's very
Right.
parasitical, right? It's the
Yeah,
same
and I
thing
still
as
want
like,
you to go
yeah.
on to this point, but it's interesting because as you point out and as we've read in Seminar 16, Lacan is very well, not even very highly critical of Lucien Goldmann. He criticizes him under the pseudonym of Mudger Metal, uh,
Mm-hmm.
and will even call him the sort of leading of intellectual of the Marxist clergy. So after laying that out, what is it that he actually sees wrong with Goldman, but yet at the same time will take on
Well,
the Pascalian wager?
it's very interesting, right? Mudger Muddle. Why is he Mudger Muddle? He's Mudger Muddle for two reasons as a pejorative nickname, right? The first one is that the words that Goldman uses to construct the Weltanschauung of the proletariat in the face of May 68 are are like mud to the prolet, like they don't stick. They're not registering, you know? Is that disjunction between knowledge and truth. It's like a point
Right.
about discourse. It's a point about speech, right? Lacan says that the protesters are manifesting the detritus and the trash of society, and they're like embodying that. Like they are that in some sense. And that's actually why I think a lot of the time he talks a lot about like shame and the crisis of shame as well, because he thinks that the protest movement has identified that, which is an interesting side point. But the Marxist priest, like Goldman, famously says, structures do not take to the streets. Lucien Goldman was the one that said that.
Mm.
Lacan's the one that offers a rebuttal of this. That's the perfect way to think about the logician or the savant right there. Because if structures do take to the streets, you would have to have logics to think that, which is precisely what the Marxists don't have. So, anyways, uh, a lot of this goes back to humanism as well, and what we mean by Marxist science, right? Because one of the things I try to argue in my paper is that Althusser is thrown into the mix here in an important way because Althusser redefines science for Marxism. And as such, because he has this idea of epistemological break, he can't recognize that the type of revolutionary praxis that the early Marx in 1844 develops under this notion of the like radical um class consciousness of exploited workers leading towards emancipation, um all of that is muddled in Lacan. All of that is in some sense um ineffective, or in some sense not the origin of how we should construe Marxist science. And that hits at the point that you mentioned before about Rancière and his reading of Lacan's influence on Marxism at the time, which was what? Which was basically to say that workers and bosses are equally deluded alike. And that ultimately there's no privileged epistemic privilege based on class. So that goes against my Marxist commitments because, Andrew, as you know, I actually want to read Lacan, but I don't want to accept everything. Because if that is a conclusion of Lacan, I'm not going to accept it. Because I have like commitments to thinking, a revolution in the condition of the working class, based on all of my studies and what I've done and my experience and so on.
Right. And for me too, I think the problem would be is the notion of humanism and anti-humanism, which I think is a sort of historical sort of
Mm-hmm.
conflict, and in the way that Lacan is, I wouldn't even say Lacan would have considered himself an anti-humanist, but he has many times rebutted against the humanism of his day, and it's mainly from, well, you could correct me if I'm wrong. I don't know if it's from the Marxist humanist side, but I know that he has been very critical of humanism insofar that it talks about freedom, but the main proponents that he has always critiqued humanism on are Sartre and Merleau-Ponty,
Mm-hmm.
especially in Seminar 2, when Merleau-Ponty gave a seminal lecture on psychoanalysis and philosophy. He
Mm-hmm.
believes that philosophy, insofar that it's phenomenological, and psychoanalysis are humanism because they aim at understanding, to which Lacan says no, that it cannot because you can't understand somebody, will never understand, but also because of the death drive. But my point is that I too would be hesitant to take on Lacan's position against humanism because I do want to rethink a form of Marxist humanism, and the condition of humanism insofar as, from the Lacerdo group that
Yeah.
or that I participated in, the problem of the colonial question, the national question for human
Yeah.
liberation. So that is my sort of pitching on that, with my problem of taking Lacan's word as, gospel. But again, there's still a lot of things. And again, with Lacan, it's always a question concerning teaching. And I think what he's trying to do is teach us, not for us to
Yeah.
assimilate everything.
No, exactly. I mean, I'm comfortable with but you see, as a younger student, I think that I would have been swept off my feet and kind of drawn to the same conclusion that Rancière was concerned with at the time, which is ultimately a rebuttal, according to Rancière, of the science of Marxism-Leninism itself, which is based on the notion of class conscious workers organizing strategically for gaining power, things of that nature, right? And so if Lacan is telling us that the process whereby a worker subtracts themselves from day-to-day exploitation and becomes more militant, if he's showing us a form of servitude that traditional Marxism hasn't been able to theorize, which is exactly what Althusser says is so important about Lacan for Marxism, mainly his theory of the imaginary and this idea of servitude, um, which I get into towards the end of my paper around Lacan's criticism of the rebel, right? Um, we can get into that in a moment. That's the heart of what I want to learn. That's the heart of what I want to retain. But I don't want to make Lacan a substitute practice. But the truth is, I think that a lot of people have done that. And I would even say that Zizek has done that in a lot of ways, in a lot of ways, actually, which I could get into, but we don't have to get into that. Um, does you see what I'm saying? Because that's kind of
Yeah.
where I'm at with my relationship with Lacan is sort of how do we piece these things together and not um, allow for a theoretical discourse to override a tradition of liberation and strategic politics that has like worked historically, you know?
And still is operating regardless of the failures in USSR and other surrounding, countries. It's still operating. It is still a form of liberation, if not the only form. We could talk about that maybe on the side, but I
Yes,
would agree like
exactly.
that it is still the means of national liberation. I mean, this is again what Lacerdo is talking about in the Western Marxist text,
And
which
the
is
the
so
thing to
seminal.
Stalin, yeah, exactly. And the thing apropos Stalin, you know, is that everything here, the text that Stalin wrote is called Marxism and Language. And I would recommend folks read Boris Groys in his wonderful book. Um, I think it's called The Communist Problem, if I'm not mistaken. I could have butchered that title, but it's very interesting. And you should also read Stalin's text itself. It's not that long.
It's very short. You
It
can find it
is,
on the archives. I was
yeah,
reading it earlier on the archive.
Marxist.org. Mm-hmm.
That's correct. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's not that long. I mean, it's crazy, right? Like, who is Stalin to write this text? You know what I mean? Like, and the thing is, though, is that it set a research agenda and a scientific approach to the humanities for decades after it was published in 1950. And what Milner shows is that Lacan and Foucault both were trying to develop accounts not only of language, but of historical change that would be different than the Stalinist theory. So the interesting thing here is that the Stalinist theory of historical change after this essay uh, ultimately removed the any theory, and this is coming from Stalin, of like uh, a dialectic of what you called before of base and superstructure as having any foothold within thinking historical change vis-a-vis discourse, language, meaning, because meaning is in symbolism and so on. In that sense, it's a pure mechanistic evolutionary theory. That goes back to the Marxist humanism of Goldmann, because for Goldmann, what is the creation of the Weltanschauung? It's about creating the possibility for the construction of a shared meaning.
Yeah. The
So
we
that
as
the
and in
we,
his book
the we,
on
the
Kant's
construction
too.
of the we.
Mhm.
And what is Lacan saying to Goldmann? Saying all of your words, all of your theory is not constructing the we. It's not uniting these new class assemblages that need to be united. That's the same thing Alain Badiou says about 68 as well, right? Which is that 68, because what did 68 show optimistically? 68 showed for a brief moment an incredible, impossible unity, impossible even for our time. Just think of it. Think of the Gaza uprising at the campuses uniting with factory workers.
Hmm.
That's what happened in 68,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
68 was not just a student thing.
No, no,
68 also had like traditional working class and students
absolutely.
like full solidarity.
Yeah.
In a sense, that's why it's so important,
Mhm.
right?
And
Because
another
the
thing,
question is,
like,
how do you reconnect that?
right.
How do
And
you
it wasn't
relink that?
wasn't it also like during that time too, like, yes, the students and the workers were uniting, but the PCF uh were siding with the liberal state and actually trying to stop the protest
Eventually,
eventually.
eventually. Yeah,
Right.
eventually. Yeah, because I mean, that's the thing, right? I mean, when you're in power, and the French Communist Party had a degree of power for some time and some negotiation and possibility with the liberal government, you also have to introduce restraint, right? So the libertine direction of 68 was insisting on this demand, which was a demand for truth and enjoyment that is non-prohibited. So therefore, it created in a climate in Lacan's reading in which anyone who would interject a halting, a castration to that demand would be perceived as an authoritarian censor. And that's actually exactly why Lacan ended up playing that censor to the libertine intellectuals. And this is why, like, the Deleuze and Guattari thing happens. What did Deleuze and Guattari call Lacan when they went to the experimental university of Vincennes? Stalinist, which is pretty silly, right?
That is pretty silly.
Right. So, so yeah, that's the thing with 68. It kind of fizzled out, right, into a kind of libertinism, a kind of ultra politics that
Yeah.
became what it's known for.
Yeah. Or
But
as
as
Deleuze and
Ben,
Guattari would say, living an anti-fascist life in their anti-Oedipus text. This emphasis on that.
yeah, I mean, for them, you know, figures of reaction are in abundance, and in some sense, they wanted to create a philosophy of liberation that could excise the structural roots of all mastery, in some sense. And I think that operation, uh, what has been shown is that libertarian leftism, capitalism will allow it to do that. That's the big paradox and tragic conclusion.
Right.
Libertine leftism, which is that actually it does not contest. It does not. The accelerationist thesis, at least at that level, is false.
Right. Yeah. I mean, and bringing it to like to this point, something that you had mentioned regarding Goldmann was, clarifying what this name Mudger Muddle means. But in this case, Lacan, I want to know if like is this why he would say regarding the failures of May 68 that it was a strike on truth, right? A truth strike, that everything that the students were revolting were were not of the same intentions of what the workers, factory people were striking for. And so there was a divide on that level.
That's
Uh,
true. He does hint at that. He does hint at that. And that's actually one of the things I picked up when I closely read everything he said about class consciousness there.
mhm.
And that's actually kind of where the savant comes from. Because in some sense, the savant is a figure of becoming for the worker, the class conscious worker. And what Lacan is saying is that this process can happen, but when it occurs, the worker separates themselves from the proletariat. And this is actually why, Andrew, at the time, one of the things that Maoists were doing, they would have privileged students proletarianizing themselves by going back into work for factories, even when that's not the design of their family. The design of their family was for them to go in a middle class direction. They would rebel and go back to the factory. And so Lacan's also responding to this phenomenon itself, which is what is the worker becoming upon the ascertainment, so-called, of their class consciousness? And his answer is sort of like, well, you're separating them from the experience of the proletariat, making them into this new person. But then they're joining a community of truth, he says, in which nobody is no longer speaking the truth. Now, the reason that the Marxists are no longer speaking the truth has something to do ultimately with Lacan's theory and criticism of knowledge as construed as a worldview. Samo Tomczyk is good on this in his book, The Capitalist Unconscious, where he shows that in some sense, Lacan's continuously critical of knowledge that would be reliant on this kind of construction of a harmonious communal set of truths. In that sense, that's why he's interested, I think, also in Pascal and Pascalian individualism. It's very subtracted from that. You can see why the Jansenist alternative is more appealing to Lacan, because I think at the core, and this is somewhat biographical of Lacan, he has an anti-institutional impetus. You know what I
Right.
mean?
Yeah, he
Very
was always
critical in
bouncing
that sense.
around and like hanging out with the surrealists, the Marxists, and the sort of
Yeah.
Dadaist type.
Well, there's that, but also he's making a there's also like a meta psychological claim um regarding the distribution of jouissance from a community of a worldview, such that one of Lacan's main points would be, um, yeah, that there is actually uh like a question of identification, like identification with a and I mean I have some intuitive relationship to this general metapsychological claim. I, for example, have huge problems with feelings of alienation when I am a part of a church. You know what I mean? I'm never good in large groups myself. This is part of the reason why I am drawn to a thinker like Lacan, because I think that
What?
Lacan's general insights regarding otherness and the critique of the ego and the critique of ego psychology that Lacan brings to bear, all
Mhm.
tied into this same idea.
Yeah,
Right? So there's a certain sense of the aggression of fraternity in some
right,
way.
right. And what is excluded in the process or lost? And I mean, it goes back to, what he's talking about, jouissance. But it makes me think in this in what you're saying. And I do relate to that too, especially like when I was like not only with the church, but also in the military. That's why I got
Military,
out.
yeah.
But it's also interesting because then it goes back to what I referenced was Mazaros earlier, right? And his work on alienation. And there's this really good section in the beginning of where he talks about the outsider philosopher, right? And so in the sense, like Lacan has that privilege of having that outsideness because of his anti-institutionalism, whereas of someone like Althusser was kind of tied to the institutions, right? But
Yeah.
then Marx
Yeah.
himself was kind of an outsider, according to Meszaros, Rousseau, Spinoza, and even Lucien Goldmann will say this in his Kant book about the outsider with no, what is he? With Lukács, that Lukács shared this sort of romanticism that he was struggling with because of his outsiderness, and that was a sort
hmm
of sentiment that was celebrated as an extent.
hmm
Um, so there is sort of
No,
something to that.
exactly. Like you could say one of Freud's insights into religion is that the truth of religion needs to, and you see this in Judaism and Islam very much.
Right, right.
Both religious communities are founded by an outsider to the religious community itself.
Hmm.
And so, therefore, the truth of the community is founded on a point of otherness to itself,
Right.
for which it's always seeking and must seek to integrate that otherness. One of the problems with a worldview, I think this is where Lacan can help us, is that if you don't account for lack and negativity and the otherness at the foundation of the worldview, then that worldview will produce dupes, right?
Yeah.
And a dupe is basically somebody that cannot locate how exploitation is working.
Right. That's where you go from the non-dupe pair to the non-dupes heir, right? The in his later stuff, which apparently, according to Milner, which is interesting, and I think that's great. The great thing about this essay that you've written and is that Milner shows and you shows like the relationship between Lacan and Marxism in this era, but then in the later years, he tragically divorces himself from Marx. And so that would mean Marxism
Right,
altogether. So then he
right,
goes to this sort of Joycean um,
right.
era.
Well, I think that's true. And I think uh let's put it this way. Lacan is touched by Marxism, like it or not.
Mhm.
He's mesmerized. He's seized by
Mhm.
Marx. Maybe definitely not by Marxism, but by
Yeah,
Marx,
the Marx.
right? And that's fine. One of the things that we know then is therefore that um and Lacan himself says this over and over again, so Marx is in all things a revolutionary thought, revolutionary philosophy. And therefore, I think that Lacan's theory of the subject and of the unconscious in his Marxist period from mm, 67 to the mid 70s, you know, however long that is, 7, 8 years or whatever, um, is one of the most exciting periods of Lacan's work. The discourse theory, the Milan lectures, um, from another to the other side of psychoanalysis on a discourse that might not be a semblant, right?
Yeah.
All of those. And then, I mean, even before that, in his correspondence with Althusser and so on in the early 60s,
Hmm.
so you already had it there,
Right.
it's already building there. And,
Right.
I know uh, Lacan had read Marx, he tells us as a young man too. So, but no, but I mean, I think, yeah, the revelation in the 1970s of the empirical data regarding what happened in the USSR, but a lot of that was also, like the gulags and things like that, the number of deaths that died from famine in Mao's China, right? Um, the release of the Gulag Archipelago text, right, by Solzhenitsyn. Um, all of we can never underestimate. All of that gave birth to what's called the new philosophers in France, who were basically like radical liberal reactionaries, who then teaming up with this like like we have like Fukuyama.
Yeah.
Fukuyama happened before Fukuyama in France.
Mm.
All of that happened before in intellectual life with a figure called Francois Furet.
Right.
And
Yeah. Which
and
I've heard. Yeah.
right, this like critique of Marxist historiography and Marxist historicism, which is very and then they wrote this text called the Black Book of Communism.
Hmm.
Okay.
Hmm.
And what they argued was even before the USSR fell, right? That that Bolshevism was the final death knell of the revolutionary tradition.
Mm.
So that's actually why you get so many liberals today that disavow their own commitment to the glorious French Revolution. In other words, a lot of liberals today look at the French Revolution as if it's like the left, not liberals.
Right. It's like violent, but it's like, the revolutionary tradition is sort of spawned right there.
They don't see how it's an egalitarian rupture moment, like I talked about that concept before,
Hmm.
that shaped liberalism. And this goes back to the dialectic between the left and liberalism that interests me,
Hmm.
right? We talked about it at the very beginning of this conversation, but this is also why Losurdo is important to me.
Yes, yes. And even like
Because
what Marx was showing.
Losurdo thinks that dialectic as a tension, right?
Hmm.
Between um a dialectic for freedom,
Hmm.
right? And a kind of liberal reaction nominalizing of that dialectic.
Right. And he says that in his liberalism text because he points out the contradictions early on with not only its definition of liberty, but also
Right,
the sort of the historical reality of it and the sort of disavow of, well, whose liberty? Because most of them didn't speak a thing, Tocqueville and all these other
right.
ones, John Locke, about slavery. In fact, they were proponents of slavery. And so that creates a sort of contradiction and antagonism, but then it paves the way for when the French Revolution happens, as you pointed out, now we get into a dialectic of not only liberalism, but also what would be the proto-socialism to which Marx comes to the scene. And then now we get
Exactly.
dialectic of socialism and
Exactly. And in Althusser's um conception of Marxism in science, we lose all of that. We
hmm
lose all of that. And you know, Marxism becomes this Marxism becomes kind of like a discourse of scientific novelty about theory itself. Like Marxism, after Althusser is done with it, and I know that I'm being highly critical of Althusser. I adore him as a philosopher, and I love reading his work, of course. But I'm saying that the effects
the
of
effects,
his
yeah.
intervention have been to detether Marxism from the struggle and the history of this dialectic that stretches back to the opening of modernity with the French Revolution and so on. So
Yeah, absolutely.
this is why I'm very much interested in reopening that yeah, reopening a different form of historicism ultimately, because that's a big thing that's at stake here is Lacan's development of the four discourses, which we didn't talk about much, is like his revision on historicism.
Right. And even, the relationship, because we've talked about the conception of science for Althusser and even of Marxism to an extent, but the relationship that Lacan has to science is to what Milner would say as like, well, he talks about it in classicisms and that it's really his sort of conjunction of Alexander Corre, the French scientific philosopher or the philosopher of science, and then also Alexander Kojève, the one who brought Hegel to France and gave a series of lectures. And that what Corre says is that the ancient world is far different from the modern world. And modern world breaks away from the ancient world of, harmony in the cosmos with modern science and how they only had theoria and praxis, theory and the way to actualize theory or philosophy. And episteme existed, sort of science, but technology was very limited. But it's through modern science that technology and episteme actually share a relation. So we have a science of precision, but basically a cosmos that becomes mathematizable. And that's because of Leibniz and Descartes. And then you have the way in which Kojève says that we get the modern world, modernity, because of the breakaway from ancient antiquity due to Christianity. And that is where Lacan will align himself according to Milner in his work called The Clear of, right? Which
Yeah.
is, as you were talking about, the way in which we could see Lacan operating into, and it's interesting because it's a subversion of the exoteric versus the esoteric. What we
Mm.
would see as the esoteric, which would be these hidden mystery cults, and again, his seminars were like that, but they're very easy to understand. Of course, his teaching's hard, but they're very easy to understand. Now, the more exoteric, which were published essays, which would be compiled in the écrit, are very esoteric. They're hard to read. Many people pull their hairs when they try to read just one sentence of it. And so it's sort of interesting. But again, like my point is like his relationship to science is merely one where we see that science has foreclosed its truth in the process of doing so, and that is the subject or the subject of science. And it paves the way for psychoanalysis because of a universe that is mathematizable or created in a mathematical universe. And so that would be Milner's thing.
Yeah, and that's really excellent summary. And I mean, it is just interesting to. It's always important to situate the political stakes of a thinker, um, precisely because their novelty, their originality is often formed off of the need politically to distinguish themselves from a movement for which they have a strong aversion or a strong disagreement for various
Mhm.
reasons. I think there's many examples of that when you look at like yeah, the construction of a thinker. Like I just gave a talk, for example, on Hegel
Mhm.
and censorship,
Right, right, right,
right? Because Hegel formulates so much of his political thought, right, off of an extremely careful uh model of self-censorship so that
which
not
Lucerdo brings up,
merely,
right, in his text Hegel and the Moderns, right?
yeah,
In one
that's
of
what
them.
I'm really leaning
Yeah.
on, but also very much influenced by Leo Strauss's essay called like Writing in the Art of Persecution,
Mm,
where he shows that like you can go back to all ancient philosophers and see how they navigate censorship because in a sense, think about it this way. Uh okay, why is Socrates put to death, right? Like if philosophy is to have an ounce of use, you would know it's it would prove itself precisely by butting up against status quo paradigm. If you have a philosophical system which is not facing tension from the status quo and the gatekeepers, and they're not agitated with you in some way, do you know that's a sign that is not actually changing and mixing things up. Therefore, it's not actually philosophical,
right,
right? Because there is that, and so it's political, but it's also like an element of censorship precisely because you have censorship insofar as what you're introducing into the world is a cut. The truth would be something which is cutting, something which is punctuating, right?
right,
A feel, a worldview, a set of presuppositions, and et cetera, right? You're upsetting establishment discourse. Now, Marxism is interesting because Marxism is founded off of that. So naturally, if Marxism becomes a bureaucracy, it loses that cutting capacity. And that's the
absolutely.
last thing, that you want Marxism to lose.
Right. And therefore that's why it falls in for Lacan in this university discourse, right?
Exactly.
Of sort of a
Exactly.
set of knowledge that addresses an other that is barred, right?
And even, yeah, exactly. And it's like, even, you know, um, yeah, because he calls Marxism in the 19th century the hysterics discourse, right?
Hmm.
And he has a long meditation in Seminar 16, right, about the proletariat as so, like to paraphrase, he says something very interesting towards the end of Seminar 16, I think the second to last session. They represent and constitute like the first like self-conscious refusal of indentured servitude at like the last bastion of where it still resided. You know what I'm saying? So it's like Marxism upsets the master-slave dialectic at its roots, at its core. And that's a hysterical move. And then it becomes a debate, because how can Marxism reconnect to its hysterical foundation, I
Right.
guess you say.
Right, right. Which is always trying to provoke the desire of the other, as Lacan says in his discourse of bringing forth enigmas, which I still kind of am confused on what these enigmas are. But that's sort of what allows for this quarter turn to happen within
Mm-hmm.
the
Mm-hmm.
given discourse, right? And it comes from
Mm-hmm.
the hysteric, and that's why I think what he would say, like Socrates, is in a sense
Mm-hmm.
embodiment of the hysteric. Um,
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah, that's right. Posing the hysteric is a very philosophical discourse in
or
that
even
sense.
Hegel would be that one as well,
Yeah,
as
exactly. Exactly. Yeah. So so obviously, it's good to reconsider all of this because it's extremely rich material. And very vital for, like, I think, yeah, what I've tried to argue is that you know, Lacan can dignify uh the meaning of being a committed Marxist, right? Without, and that we can do that, we can do that differently than I think a lot of our mentors have done it. Like Leclau, like Zizek, and I
right.
mean, I
Yeah.
don't want to like offend them exactly or whatever. I'm not here to criticize them right now, just because I know it's late and we've been talking for a while. But I just think that what we're trying to derive here is different than what they derived.
Right. Yeah. And I
And I
think
think
like
that should be acknowledged.
yeah, I do like Zizek's like critique of Leclau, and I think like I'm not saying that everybody today is Leclauian, but the way in which we have to unite by a shared common enemy, doesn't lead to anywhere. And if again with the election, if
Oh,
we're
there's
if we're
so
voting
many
for
issues
Kamala,
with him.
yeah, if we're voting for like Kamala because our shared enemy is Trump, that's not going to solve anything. It's the slogan either Kamala or fascism. When both are capitalists, that it's defeatism. It's
Yeah, that's something we can talk about at a future time, but
in
I
a future time.
definitely agree. I
Yeah,
definitely agree.
and for Zizek, it's his ambiguity with his political statements, but I think even then, it's like the way in which he even talks about class and then not talks about class, I find very problematic.
Yeah,
Um,
I mean, I think that's the thing, right? It's that Marxists, after Althusser, have abandoned organization largely, um, abandoned a particular commitment to working class liberation, um, which I don't have the energy to get into it fully
yeah,
right now, but actually maybe we could do like a follow-up on that because
yeah, it's a very
it's a very in-depth thing, and there's like it's elusive. It's
hmm
elusive because Althusser is a highly inconsistent thinker.
hmm
He's a great, brilliant thinker, but he's very weird because even in his late years, he has this self-criticism period, but you'll notice that he will say things that sound like he's resurrecting and therefore effacing everything he has developed. I mean, just read his memoir and you'll get a sense of this. I don't know if you've read it. It's you get all of these elisions and self-effacements, and like he sounds like an orthodox Marxist, even though we thought that we had gone past that. So there's a lot of confusions with Althusser, but there's
right.
also a lot of children that he has given birth to
hmm
that are very much the anchor points for how most of us think of Marxist politics.
hmm
So he's inescapable in that regard.
Right. Yeah, no, no,
But
yeah.
but the influence has been damaging.
Yeah.
I fully follow Isabel Garo there in
You're
that
right. Yeah,
regard.
which I haven't read, but I know you've mentioned her quite a bit in passing discussions. But I know it is getting late, but I think lastly, yeah, like I think like overall, what is the sort of message of like the gadfly, and I guess what is Marxism to you, and why, not only should we read this essay, but what does it mean to be a Marxist in our time?
Yeah, I mean, I think Marxism has a stake in philosophy, as we've tried to articulate it,
Mhm,
which is the Marxism um, is a project for the liberation of humanity
mhm,
on the one hand, but in a certain strategic sense, Marxism is about the overcoming of capitalist alienation and capitalist social relations. It's about the achievement. I mean, I'm not going to get into like a whole expose about
right.
what Marxism is, but I mean, in a certain sense, Marxism is a practice. It's not a
Mhm,
philosophy, it's a practice. It's a
mhm.
practice for the achievement of the transcendence of capitalism, which is something that happens in stages. It doesn't happen magically all at once. It's not some
No.
kind of utopian abolition fantasy. I mean, I still think that the idea of the dictatorship of the proletariat, which Marx said is his most important idea,
Mhm,
is meant to be thought as a uh, like Marx has this phrase after he witnessed the Paris Commune, which is that the proletariat cannot immediately seize the existing governmental
mhm,
reins.
mhm.
Those reins need to be um, modified. They need to be negated so that they can be
Right.
negated again.
And
So
this
in
is
a
what
sense, you
Lenin will
have
say
this
as well.
idea. Yeah, you have this idea of the negation of the negation. That's one way to think of the two-part movement of the revolution of bourgeois society,
Mhm,
in which the proletariat is the kind of final class, right? As globalization sets in and as um, capitalism envelops its insidious sort of force field over all of us, Marxism has a kind of teleological wager as part of its uh, strategy, that there is a sort of practical way to overcome that collective. But as you as you probably know, Marx also posits that bourgeois society and capitalism is itself bringing us to a point. Um, well, capitalism is progressive. Capitalism is advancing. Like we're constantly seeing all of these advances in new cities and new technology and smartphones and computers and fancy new cars. While at the same time, we live in this world of radical segregation, radical racism, radical otherization, radical suffering. And the paradox of that suffering is that the people cannot name the true cause of that suffering, right? So it becomes displaced. It becomes like a great return of the repressed, right? So Marxism is also about philosophy, insofar as philosophy can aid Marxism. And here I follow this in my work on Nietzsche, connecting to a kind of development of a rational construction of a proletarian perspective. Only a proletarian perspective can address the condition that only capitalism creates of a class which is deprived and alienated in a number of ways, in
mhm.
ways which are almost unspeakable in some cases,
Right.
right? And so Marxism for me is about identifying how to overcome that condition, which is a condition brought on by material relations and forces of production
Mhm,
that we can materially locate, which requires education, right?
mhm,
Because it's actually in bourgeois society, bourgeois ideology fetishizes that, i.e., it covers that over, right? So Marxism is about, it's also a sort of revolutionary discourse of the revelation of alienation and the possibility of overcoming it.
right.
So therefore, Marxism is about the construction of the we.
Mhm,
Absolutely. It has to be, right? Um, and the freeing of humanity. I mean,
mhm,
those are not cliches. I think that that's something that needs to be brought back onto the table, and
mhm.
institutions need to be constructed around those ideas.
Yeah, and I
It,
think that's the biggest point is ideas, and it's not like the sort of, oh, let's all get educated. But I think it's interesting in our day and age that autodidacticism has become a huge thing, especially because of the internet and the beauty
mhm.
of intellectuals on the internet and what we're doing right now.
Yeah.
And you know, I think what makes me more of a Marxist is that, my labor is being exploited on the basis of not a bourgeois or a working ruling class person to take my money and then continue to educate themselves. No, it's about their otium, their leisure time to go vacate somewhere
Hmm.
and do go to a resort or go to a retreat and talk about, how they're self-made. And I think that's the difference between the ideologies, today. One of otium, and I'm not saying that everybody in the working class is you're in the business of ideas, but you see a lot more people in the working class that if you look at their cognitive mapping, they're very much curious. And to the degree that they're able to access certain materials, they're
Right.
still, wanting to know things and wanting to know.
Well, that actually takes us back to this savoir-faire,
Right.
right? Which is what's the type of knowledge that is of a theoretical nature that is used? That is what Lacan hints at that's so interesting.
Hmm.
Theoria for practical knowledge, right?
Yeah.
That's the intersection that we should be concerned with, right? And that I think is what makes working class intellectuals unique. Because when a working class intellectual studies a material of theory, they're going to bring that practical application because
Hmm.
because the stakes are life.
Hmm.
The stakes are enjoyment, life, and overall well-being, like in some
Hmm.
sense, and the construction of a world in which the impediments of mindless labor are no longer impediments. There's many
Hmm.
ways to try to achieve that. You can take this kind of cutthroat capitalist way to achieve that, but in doing so, you've undercut all of your friends and family and comrades if you're from a
Yeah.
working class background, right? If you're from a
Yeah.
middle class background, the problem with that is that you're thrown into a social situation in which you don't see the way the suffering functions.
Right.
You don't
Yeah.
see you don't see the way that people get eviscerated, and that matters to me.
Mhm.
You know what I mean? That matters, that like that proximity to that actually does mean something. It doesn't mean that they become glorious subjects that are deified.
Mhm.
No, there's nothing like that.
Mhm.
I just think that it means that there's a certain urgency and militancy of imperative demands that
Mhm.
that should encourage in us. It shouldn't be the source of some like resignation and sadness and tragedy.
Mhm.
That's why I'm big on this notion of Marxism and optimism.
Right. Yeah, and I know that you were like, I think said like that you were criticized for saying that melancholia is not the best solution for revolutionizing. So I wouldn't even understand like what the point of privileging an affect, of that nature or just anything other ressentiment or something like that as the sort of source for not even political antagonism, but also like for emancipation. Um, I don't think any sort of melancholic in the clinic feels emancipated for their melancholia, let alone would it be something of a collective organizing.
Well, they have the view, right?
Right.
That like they kind of take this theory of, you know what I call egalitarian rupture, right? As like
Yes.
these events that happen. They kind of make a claim that there's like a that like yeah, they would say like yeah, those events happen for sure, but the precondition of them is based on the worsening of the situation.
Mm.
Say, I'll give you an example. Are you aware of what triggered the Arab Spring?
No, I'm not.
It was a shopkeeper, Mohammed Bouazizi, who set himself on fire out of despair. And that created like literally like a domino effect, right? So that's kind of like their point of view. And I think that there's some validity to that, you know, from the standpoint of understanding the kind of, the the causality of rebellion and uprisings and stuff like that. But I just feel that you can't construct a positive organization off of sad affects.
Hmm.
Exactly. And so there becomes, anyways, a fetishization of sad affects and spontaneity that I find limited.
Hmm.
That was the basis of that debate.
Right. Yeah, and that makes sense. Yeah.
You know, yeah.
Mhm. Well, I mean, if you don't have anything else to add, this was a very, very enlightening discussion, and always glad to have you on, comrade. And again, a brilliant essay. And I really think, again, like like as you said, like yeah, it came out in the beginning of 2024, right? The Seminar 16 was published and
Yeah.
released. Yeah, and so like just to read this and then to see the wild connection that Lacan makes not only to, I think we've
Yeah.
already done this prior of surplus jouissance and surplus value, but the way in which he connects discourse into the realm of capital, and again this notion of absolutization of the market and how that affects revolutionary struggle and its logic that keeps knowledge from being a savoir-faire for the proletariat. I think that's like the hugest thing that I got from it, and having to rethink the possibility of what would the Marxist intellectual be in that and not be a clergy, you know.
Yeah. No, I'm really happy that we had this conversation. It helped me think through these points, and it's given me a lot more understanding of where psychoanalysis fits in relationship, where Freud fits with Marx, or
Yeah.
where psychoanalysis fits with revolutionary thought. Yeah.
Yeah,
Uh,
and
so
it's
it's
one
good.
thing, and then like last thing is just one thing that's really interesting. It's like I think because of their historical upbringing and the way they converge, it's impossible to not really think them both simultaneously, especially today, and the long sort of dialogue that they have
Mm.
with each
Hmm.
other, and I think like not only with this text, but Rose Itchner's text has really helped me elucidate the standing relationship between Marx and Freud and psychoanalysis and Marxism, as a tradition.
It's so good. Yeah, I'm going back to that text so much. I'm
Yeah.
actually going to be writing a book on Freudian Marxism, and it's going to be featured very prominently.
Yeah. I mean,
Very
and
prominently.
especially the last thing is just this artificial group, or this the group that,
Mm.
can spontaneously rise and create change. I think that has to be capitalized more for
Hmm.
revolutionary thinkers. I think that was the beauty of Freud, without him realizing it, that he did something so great like that. And
Yeah.
his critique of Le Bon and other group psychologists,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, the artificial groups are
church
like
and state.
church, army, corporation. It would
Yeah.
be spontaneous
Oh,
groups.
spontaneous groups. Yeah, yeah. I've confused it.
But
Yeah.
well, but then it's also like he hints at revolutionary groups
Hmm.
as well. So it's crazy what Rosicner pulls from that text. It's a brilliant reading.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. But yeah, like I said, thank you again for coming on. This was a
Yes,
conversation. Yeah,
I
and
really learned a lot. All
yeah,
the
no,
best.
same. Thank you.
All right,
Awesome.
thanks
Well,
everyone.
thank you. Thank you, everyone. I hope you enjoyed this.